Thanks for listening to the Media People Podcast, lively and insightful chats with the people who power the media industry. I'm your host, Victor Genova. For more episodes, you can go to mediapeople.ca or subscribe wherever you get podcasts, including youtube.com/@mediapeoplepodcast. Views expressed by participants are personal. The title producer is everywhere in show business. But what exactly does a producer do? It's a bit of a loaded question as responsibilities can vary, but it's a question that today's guest, Jodie Davis, will answer for us. Jodie has spent over 20 years in television, and there's a good chance you're familiar with his work. Jodie has worked on many of the major Canadian awards shows, including the Juno and Gemini Awards. He was entertainment producer on Toronto One's The A-List before getting the chance to executive produce ET Canada. Jodie Davis stops by to chat about growing up in Uxbridge, Ontario, simultaneously attending both York University and Seneca College, a producer's collective duties, and what it's like producing Canada's biggest entertainment news show.
I'm an entertainment executive. I was the executive producer at Entertainment Tonight Canada for the past 17 years. As well, right now, I'm a broadcast and digital consultant working with broadcast and digital companies to help them improve on their social media platform and their sort of broadcast reach, giving them assessments and recommendation on their editorial content and figure out a way that they can make money on digital platforms.
I'm really excited you stopped by today. I do not get a lot of people that work on the production side of the business. Let's go back to the beginning, Jodie. Where are you from?
I'm from a small little town called Uxbridge, Ontario. It's about 90 minutes northeast of Toronto.
What was life like growing up in Uxbridge?
It was difficult. I'm not gonna lie. I'm from a mixed race background, and in the town back in the 80s, there wasn't very many people who looked like me. So definitely there was some bullying based on the way I looked. And also it was a bit of a, it's a farm community at the time. It's definitely grown since then, but there wasn't a lot to do for kids my age. There's a lot of, we rode our bikes around the town, went to local arcade, but other than that, it was very hard to do things without getting in trouble in Uxbridge.
Okay, so what was your local arcade game? You threw that out there? Mortal Kombat,
My local arcade,
Street Fighter?
Street Fighter was good. I like Gauntlet a lot better though.
Okay, there's one I haven't heard in a while.
Definitely when you could have 4 people playing at the same time, that was always fun to do that. But yeah, Street Fighter, Gauntlet, Mortal Kombat, they were all sort of the big ones at the time.
Did you move around or did you stay in Uxbridge most of your life?
I was in Uxbridge for the first 13 years of my life, and then my parents got divorced. My father moved to another small town called Port Perry, which is about 15 minutes from Uxbridge. So I spent half the time there and half the time in Uxbridge. And then as soon as I could, I got out of both of those towns and moved to Toronto at the age of 18.
Okay, so you and I had similar interests growing up. You were big into sports cards, and
Yeah.
you were sports cards, I should say, and you were also very big into comic books. I want to start with the latter first, though. What character did you collect?
I was coming up around the time that there was these 2 new sort of comic lines called Image and Valiant launch. So Image launched with a character named Spawn, and Valiant had, I think there was one called Youngblood. I can't remember the rest of them at the time, but they were sort of the 2 that I really got into. I sort of missed the Marvel sort of explosion when I was sort of starting collecting comics. They were splitting up like X-Men and things like that. I did get into a bit of Batman, and especially when the whole thing with Bane, the whole thing with the death of Superman, all those sort of mid-90s big events in the comic world I got into.
What attracted you to Spawn? Because it's very hard to deviate from DC and Marvel. And I remember when Todd McFarlane broke away and said, you know what, I'm doing my own thing with my own company, and started Spawn.
It just seemed like a different way of telling stories at the time. And I found the art just so amazing that was in the Spawn comics. And yeah, it just felt like a little bit fun. And I felt like, as I said, I felt like the Marvel was getting a bit gimmicky with the way they were splitting everything up. Even like when they relaunched Spider-Man, and they had like 6 different covers. It was just all, I found a bit too gimmicky. So I did want to, I found Spawn a little bit more truer to what I thought comic books were supposed to be.
And what about sports cards, which for the younger people listening were NFTs before there were NFTs?
Yeah, so my dad. It was a way for me and my dad to sort of connect. I found it was, we would he would buy them obviously when I was younger, and then we would sort of look through them and see what we had and things like that. It is again before sort of the boom in sports cards in the 90s. I had a lot of the OPG sets, and then on baseball side a lot of Tops and Flair, and then like late 80s, mid 90s, everybody and their brothers got into sports card and became a flooded market. I still was into it, but then sort of at the time started making my own money, so I would buy some of the older stuff and try to get things like that. And I was really into trying to build up my collection, but go sort of the older way, because I was seeing how like the newer cards were just like everybody, as I said, everybody was trying to get into it and trying to make a quick buck on it, and it just sort of took the fun away.
Did you lay them out in binders with those sheets, or did you keep them vertical in those boxes where you had to pull out each one very carefully one by one?
I did both. I had some in binders, I had some in boxes, and a lot of them in the hard case sleeves. That was anyone that was like over $5, I put into a hard case sleeve. And then the ones that were really worth a lot of money, there was those cases that had the screws that you had to screw them into.
Yeah, I remember those.
And then even a few I kept in the unsealed wax. So I still have a few boxes somewhere in my house that haven't been opened.
Is there a particular card that you can't let go of, like a very special one?
Yeah, I do have a Gretzky rookie.
Oh,
It's not
damn.
it's not the
Oh,
big mint condition. It has a bit of rough corner on it. But yeah, that's definitely the prized possession.
here, funny story for you about priceless objects not in great condition. Going back to how you were a Spawn fan, I
Hmm.
remember being in the eighth grade and I was big into comic books and I saw these kids just trashing their comic books at recess. They were far younger than me in elementary
Okay.
school. And it turned out the kid was holding it was Spawn number one,
Yeah.
and it was just in horrible condition. Now,
Okay.
granted, at that point, I think, I think Spawn had a monthly series for about 4 years at that point,
Okay.
so maybe they were about 50 issues deep. But I remember looking at that and being old enough, going, "What did you do?"
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
was just oh. Do you kick yourself when you see that Gretzky rookie card and go, "Oh my God,
Um.
that's freedom
No.
in plastic right there."
Yeah. It's still in good enough condition that it's still worth a bit. It's just not in the best of condition. I sort of inherited that way. Like it was when I got it out of the pack. It wasn't it wasn't 100% mint even when I got out of the pack. So I'm not too concerned.
Why do you cite Mrs. McNally, your computer lab teacher, as being one of your biggest influences growing up?
As a child who was bullied in school, you lose a lot of confidence in yourself. And she sort of saw something in me that not too many other people did. Um, she allowed me to, there was computer science at the time was a very new sort of concept in high school that you took. And I caught on to it pretty quickly. And she saw that I was very interested into it. So she's, let me come back a year later to be sort of a volunteer co-op student, and then sort of showed me the ropes. She showed me how to put together a class for a day. She showed me how to mark papers, and just gave me the confidence to stand in front of people who I normally would not want to stand in front of, and be able to sort of address them in a sort of more authority way.
So a lot of professional skills were developed under her.
Yeah, for sure.
Your first job ever, did it even feel like a job working at a collectible store?
No, it didn't. It's interesting story. So it was in the town Port Perry that I spoke about. It was called Twice Told Tales. It was a comic book card store and also sold paperbacks, used paperbacks. So I was in there one day. I would go in there, maybe once a week and buy something, or with my dad, would go in there and buy some stuff. And a gentleman was in there, and he was talking to the owner, and he was claiming something that I knew wasn't true about hockey cards. So I sort of stood up and said, that that's not true at all. That player does not appear in that hockey card set. And the guy didn't believe me at all, and started a little argument with the 12-year-old at the time. And finally he laughed, and the boss, the owner of the store, said, "You know a lot about cards. I want you to come work for me." I'm like, okay. And so yeah, I spent time there, helping selling cards, sorting cards, just hanging out, selling comics. It was just, it was pretty much a teenage boy's dream come true.
Reading a lot of comics too, I imagine.
Yeah, reading comics, and there was a little bit of a discount working there, so I was able to have my collection grow pretty quickly.
There was a comic shop I used to frequent in Etobicoke called Pendragon, and they had this system set up where if you prepaid for your comics, they would hold on to them. Because
Hmm.
what was it? Tuesday was it Wednesday? I could have
Can't
sworn
remember the
Wednesday.
day. Yeah.
I think Wednesday was the drop date for comics. And then about a couple of years ago, DC said, "Screw it, we're moving it to Tuesday,"
Mm.
because they wanted to publish and drop a day before Marvel and everyone else did. But did they have a system set up like that? Because they'd only get a limited number of comics in.
Yeah, they did. So you could sort of reserve titles, as you said, like you could prepay, and like some people, they would have 6 or 7 titles they get a week. Some would only have one or two, and yeah, they would just do that. Like you could say, these are, I want Cable, I want Deadpool. Here's my money.
So when you're watching a comic book movie and there's a reference to a very specific story that only us passionate comic book lovers would recognize, do you go all nuts for that? Like I saw The Flash this weekend and I was picking out stuff with my wife, like The Dark Knight Rises.
Right.
I remember going off about that, going, this is because you already made reference to Bane. I go, this is Nightfall and Cataclysm and No Man's Land put together. And people are like, oh, but do you get like that too when you're watching those movies?
No, I don't think I do. Like I've sort of, you know, other than really maybe Sandman, I don't feel like I remember too much because I kind of stopped in my early 20s. So it was, a 6 to 8 year period that I was really into it. So other than, as I said, like Sandman and maybe some Batman stuff, I don't really remember, or not, just don't retain all that information the way that some people like yourself did.
I don't know if I retained it or I just never let go of it. That's the best way to put it. I'm 41 and I'm still reading whenever I can.
Right.
So, what brought you to York University and why this eclectic mix of studying English communications and mass media?
When I was finishing up high school, I really wanted to be a sportscaster, but I had a bit of a problem. I had always grown up with a bit of a speech issue. There's some words I just can't say, no matter how hard I try. I went through, had some speech classes when I was younger, and they helped a bit, but there's still some words I couldn't do. So I knew deep down that I would never become a sportscaster because I just wouldn't be able to pronounce a lot of players' names, especially Europeans. So I, still wanted to be in TV and radio. So I just went ahead. I, tried to get into Ryerson, which at the time was called Ryerson, and obviously was sort of the big school to go into for broadcast and media, but didn't get past the wait list. I, got to the interview stage, but never got past that. So York sort of offered some interesting side to it. Like they offered a mass communication program, so you figure out why people consume media, but didn't really offer any sort of technical side to things. And I stuck with English because they offered me a double major, and that was the other thing I was sort of interested in was reading. So I took that.
What sport did you want to cover?
Hockey.
Are you a big hockey fan, I take it?
I was, and again, like so much of my things change from what I was into as a teenager and young adult into what I am now. Like the switch between sort of sports and comics into media and music and movies and TV was sort of happened at a certain time, and it's sort of everything sort of pre that time was sports and comics, and everything after that time was music, movies, and sort of books and TV.
It's okay to admit you're a Leafs fan saddled with regrets.
I'm not actually not a Leafs fan. I was a huge Gretzky fan. Most of my cards were,
Really?
yes, I was a big Edmonton fan, and then had spent a lot of my collection in getting Gretzky stuff. So I followed him wherever he went.
Okay, so then as a child, when he moved from Edmonton to LA, what kind of
Hmm.
impact did that have on you?
Yeah, that was a big that was a big day. Like I remembered the tears in the press conference, and him leaving Edmonton, and all of a sudden I had to become a Kings fan.
Oh, so you followed him and became a Kings fan.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it was hard being a Kings fan in 1993 when everyone claims Gretzky high stick Gilmore.
that's right. Because yeah, we almost had a Canadians Leafs final.
Right. And then seeing the Kings get past the Leafs and then getting demolished by Montreal was not fun.
Saw the press release, or not the press release. I saw the press conference on YouTube a couple of months back as I sort of remembered it, didn't really remember it, and
Hmm.
everyone was crying, and I'm like, why are we crying? He gave me 4 Stanley Cups. Like you're
Yeah.
crying like like because that was the early '90s. Like he's defecting to the Soviet Union, like doing the
Right.
reverse of what like Fedorov and Pavel Bure were doing. So
Right.
and then heck, I mean, what happened after he left? The Oilers won another Stanley
Oilers won
Cup
another
without
cup.
him.
Yeah,
I think it all worked out for Edmonton, that's for sure. They got the last laugh.
they did. Yes.
After graduating from York, you re-enrolled into Seneca, and specifically, you went into their radio and television broadcasting program. So, after graduation from York, did you look at that and go, maybe this is my chance to get into broadcasting? Maybe that path is still open for me.
Right. So not to correct you a bit, but the York Seneca program was actually a concurrent program. So
Oh,
you,
geez, I got this backwards. All right. No,
yeah,
no, it's all good.
all good. So York University offered this special program to 8 students a year, where you could attend York University and Seneca College at the same time after you completed 1 year at York. So myself and 7 other students did this. We from year two at York for total of 5 years altogether, you're at York and Seneca, and you do half your time at York, half your time at Seneca. Reason why I did this is because, as I sort of mentioned earlier, York offered something on how, the theory behind why people consume media and why they consume certain media in certain ways and that sort of thing. But they never offered anything technically on how to produce this content. So Seneca did, and they offered a radio and television program, and it allowed me to be more hands-on, and I think allowed me to learn everything I needed to learn to become sort of an expert in this field.
Did you apply for the Seneca program after your first year, during your first year, like even
Yeah,
before entering York?
it was during your first year at York they you could apply for it.
Did you know about it going into York, or was that a happy surprise for you when you started
No,
there?
I did, and that was also one of the reasons why after I got the no from Ryerson, I decided to head over to York to see whether I could get into this program.
And your first role in media started well before graduation. Would
Yeah.
you say that you said it was working the Canadian award show circuit?
Yes.
Give us an give. I mean, a lot of people listening to this are going to be familiar with the Geminis and familiar with the Junos. Were they part of the award shows that you were working? And is there anything else in that mix that we're missing?
Yeah, so it was late 90s. The Junos were around, the Geminis, which were the best in television, the Genies, which were the best in Canadian film, and the NHL awards were all on CBC. And they sort of all had the same producers behind them. So once you got onto one show, they kind of kept you around. So, I started off as just a production assistant, helping out the producers. Basically, most of my job was writing scripts when there was changes to the talent, or it was stapling stuff, or like just helping out wherever you could. Really very, didn't do much addition. I wasn't much of an addition to the production, but it was good enough to be someone who was part of it and someone that you need on a team. And then from there I moved up to someone who you made sure that people, it was called a seat wrangler, leader, so making sure that people had, so when people go up to get awards, there'd be an empty seat in the audience. So you would make sure that volunteers would sit in those seats so that there would never be empty seats when the camera panned to the audience. And then from there, I end up working sort of as like a floor director, or sort of working with the talent themselves. So in the Junos, the last year that I worked with the Junos, Mike Bullard at the time was the host. So I was sort of his sort of wrangler, making sure that when producer, when Mike was in his dressing room and the producer needed him out on set to go through some lines and stuff or go through lighting, I would be the one who had to go get him and make sure he was at the right place at the right time.
You mentioned that you were doing a lot of grunt work, but
Yeah.
how much did you learn that would inform your future self just by observing what was going on around you?
Oh yeah, you learn a lot really quickly. Like you learn, I think for me, what I learned the most from that was just sort of like how important having a solid lineup is, and how important having a solid script is. And also just the fact of the communication, that making sure that everyone knows when there's a change that's happened. And that's what would happen a lot with these. You have different color scripts, and making sure everyone was on the same page, same color script at the same time was so key to having a successful show, especially when it was a live show.
And how much anxiety did you have working on live shows? Because I that can get very anxious.
Yeah, I actually, I think for me, I thrive in live. I really do think it's, for me, it's one of the most exciting ways of producing television. I didn't really have any anxiety around it. Surprisingly, now when I look back on it, you would think that I would, but no, I think it was just so exciting, and so you have so much adrenaline going when you're in a live environment, because anything could change at any time. But also, with these award shows, they were so pre-planned and so much rehearsal went into them, and people were just experts at what they do. So there was no feeling that at any time that the show was going to go a different way than what it should.
You had to have been exposed to some pretty big celebrities working the awards show scene. Were you starstruck when you started out, or did you kind of have to, or could you just compartmentalize it and treat them like just another colleague?
Yeah, definitely. it, I was I wasn't starstruck, but I definitely treated them like another colleague. I think when I look back on it, like some of the people that Celine Dion. I think one of the things I remember the most, like Celine Dion's trailer, when I saw it and all the clothes that were there, and all everything that was sort of the guard, her guard standing outside of it, that sort of like struck me, but not in a starstruck way, just like in a way like how big of a star she was, but not like that I was so taken back that that it was Celine Dion. Like I respected who she was, but I wasn't fanning over her. Same with like Shania Twain, Our Lady Peace. There was it was cool to see people who I would hear on the radio or see on TV up close and personal. But I never really, as you said, never got starstruck, but just really treated them as sort of like they were part of this team that was putting on these shows, and they just had a much bigger role maybe than what we had.
Speaking of the radio, one of your earlier roles was working the overnight was it the overnight
Hmm.
shift at
Hmm.
a classic music station? Which
Yes.
station was it?
Classical 96.3 in Toronto.
Were you a
Uh,
fan of classic music at the time?
no, didn't hate it, but I wasn't a fan of it. So, when I was in school, I did schooling on my own, right? Like as I said, I moved to Toronto. I was 18, so I was paying rent. I got a little bit of OSEP, but not enough to help cover everything for going, especially for going to two schools. So I had to find a way to make money. And these award show gigs were, there was 4 years. So like, and I really was only part of it for like a week or two at most. So I needed to find other ways to make money. So and not impact my schooling. So overnights was a good way to do that. And I think with overnights as well, they're more willing to take on inexperienced people. So yeah, I worked the overnight shift at the classical radio station. So most times the host would check out. I would be there anytime between 10 or 11, and the host would usually check out by 12. So from like 12 to 5, I was the only person in the in the building, pre-playing his taped throws to the songs. They were all on tape. And then being a classical radio station, a lot of the pieces obviously were quite long, so it could get quite boring at times when you're playing a 27-minute piece of music and being the only person in the building. So there's a lot of reading, trying to you'd walk around the building, try to stay awake, drinking a lot of coffee. And then the news guy would usually come in between 4 or 5 to do his first sort of newscast around 6 or 7.
Do you throw yourself into the genre though, just so you can be a little bit more enthusiastic when you are in between sets or in between tracks?
Yeah, I discovered a love for certain composers while I was there, but yeah, it was hard. Nothing. I think there's some really great classical music. One of the interesting things part about the job is that, so the 4 or 5 hours was programmed by somebody. Once you add in the taped VOs from the announcer, sometimes there'd be some gaps of how long of music there is. So sometimes there'd be 2 minutes where I would have to pick what I got to fill the 2 minutes with. So that was always cool, and I would sometimes go to stuff that we don't usually play. So sometimes, like it might be something from the Peanuts, or it might be a Star Wars theme, or I might go to somebody else they haven't played in a while, just to throw it in there to give me a little bit of excitement.
So John Williams
Yeah.
was classified as classical then.
Yes.
That
Yes.
counted. Okay. I
Yeah.
wasn't sure if the CRTC would come in and be like, It's not old enough. It's from the 70s. We got to go back to like maybe the 1770s for it to count.
Right. No, I think with, and I can't remember all the rules, but I think with classical, long as it was, basically orchestral of some point. There was definitely some people who were new to it that they would play. I think it's just as long as it's fit into the sort of aspect of what classical music can be.
You also did a stint early on at Much Music, and this
Hmm.
kind of paved your way to Alliance Atlantis. So explain
Hmm.
to us how working at Much Music paved your way to becoming a producer among a number of things, because you were a producer, studio producer on a number of shows within the sort of Alliance Atlantis Can West, because I know that company's gone through a number of iterations over the last
Yes.
20 years.
Yeah.
But explain to us how at least you got your foot in the door as a producer via Much Music to Alliance Atlantis. And
Yes,
also, too, let us know what a producer does, because that is a quite the umbrella term in the industry.
it is. So, yeah, I was an intern at Much in 1999, and was a great experience. I learned a lot at Much Music. Saw a lot of things. Ended up doing a little bit of work there as well. There was a show called Spotlight back then, which was basically they would pick an artist like someone big back then, like Stone Temple Pilots or Red Hot Chili Peppers, and you would sort of go through their career based on the interviews that had been done at Much in the past, mix in some music videos in between, and sort of tell a story that way. And that was sort of my first sort of foot at learning how to tell a story, from beginning to end, using interview clips and using, music videos and using B-roll to sort of tell a story. So I learned that from Much Music there. But at the time, two of the producers who I worked very closely with were leaving Much Music to go to Alliance Atlantis, because Alliance Atlantis was launching a new thing called U8 TV, the letter U, number 8 TV, which was going to be the home to a reality show called The Lofters. So when they left, I decided to go with them to there and started off as an AP there. It was associate producer, and then became a producer probably in the second season that it was on air. Back to being what a producer is, it depends a lot on the place where you're working. I think the definition of producer, as you said, has a lot of different titles, has a lot of different descriptions to it, depending again where you work. As a producer there, my job was to find guests to be on the show. We produced not, let me sort of back that up a bit. So UATV, the idea of it was there was 8 people living in a loft in downtown Toronto. Their lives were filmed 24/7, and then that storyline was then told on a show called The Lofters, which aired at the time on a network called Life Network, which is now Slice, and that was a 30-minute daily show. Part of their reason for living in a loft in downtown Toronto was they were hosting internet TV shows, anything from based on music, on news, movies. Some of these shows actually got onto broadcast as well. So there was a show called U8 on Film, which I was one of the producers on, which was also aired on the Independent Film Channel, and another one called So Gay TV, which aired on the Pride Network in Ontario at the time. So my job as a producer was to book the guests for it, to work with the other producer to help come up with questions, to maybe write some of the script, to source out material that you would need for that. So if you're talking about a certain film, so I remember one of the things we did was at the time Mulholland Falls by David Lynch was out. So what we had to do was get the film clips cleared, get set up interviews with people like Naomi Watts, who was a star in that, and then find some people to come into the loft where these hosts lived and worked, and to sort of have a debate with them about, was this a good film? What was David Lynch trying to accomplish? So I would book some film critics, or I would book a fellow director, and they would come in and sort of talk about the film in a sort of smart way, intelligent way.
How difficult is it to hunt for people at the last second to come on film and just come on television and be part of the segments? Because that's got to be pretty stressful. Like, do you always have someone in the background who's like, okay, you're our plan B in case plan A doesn't work out?
Yeah, so that mostly that role is called a chase producer, and there's some chase producers who, that I know who are who are absolutely amazing, and they can get basically anyone anytime, and they're really good at it. And there's some chase producers who, have to a lot of times depend on plan B. I think I was probably somewhere in the middle. I think, it is hard. There's some people though, who, it's not only, I think the harder thing is to get good people to be on TV. I think it's easier to get people to be on TV and to be on shows. It's hard to get someone who is really good to be on TV and be available when you need them to be.
When you look back at some of the guests you booked for that show,
hmm
are there any ones where you're just like, ooh, they oversold themselves? Like you were watching the taping happen and you're just like, ah, maybe I could have gone with someone else. But it still went to air and it was fine. But you know deep down that maybe they should have been third or fourth on your list.
I think a lot of the people that who we had, were pretty good. Like I think I was lucky to find good people. And if someone was bad, I've sort of blocked it out of my memory now and not thought about it. But yeah, I think that will happen sometimes. But usually, again, like as a producer, and one of the other things that I got to do, um, as a producer, was be in the control room with the technical crew and be the person who would be in the host ears, like they were an IFB piece, and I would sort of direct them or tell them sort of if someone wasn't strong to maybe ask questions to the other person, so that you would sort of limit how much they would be seen on TV, the people who were a little bit weaker, and just focus really on the stronger people.
How about when you're writing scripts with the talent or you're
hmm
writing scripts for the talent? How many times do they send it back and go, I would never say this? Or do you work with them on the dialogue? Do you like give them a foundation and they will edit it from there and make it their own? And if they do that, do they have to run it by you so you're not surprised when you're on camera or when they're on camera saying something that you didn't agree to or you didn't write for them?
each talent is different, and you have to approach them sort of differently. So there's some talent who you will know their voice right away, and they what you write will 99% of it will be what they will say. um there's other talent who will come to you and be like, this is not, I would never say this in real life, so I'm never going to say it on television. So there'd be some words that that I would say are very TV, like that again, and this, you know, things that people don't say in their real life. So you would have to try to make it a little bit more conversational, because I think that's one of the things that traps we fall into as producers or writers, is that you write thinking, this is what someone on TV should say, and you get out of that pretty quickly, when especially when you have a talent who says, this is something I would never say. Try to make it more conversational. So there's that. And then I think you're right. Like if they will, sometimes there'll be sort of a work where you'll be working with them. They'll be like, no, I wouldn't say that. And you would go back, you would change it and represent it to them, and see what they say. But most of the times, like it really is. And that's really a good sign of a good relationship between producer and talent, is that you will know what their voice is, and you write with their voice in mind, not with your voice in mind.
What is Toronto One? Because that's where your career took you next as a
Yeah.
senior producer. And I got to be honest, I don't remember Toronto One. I don't know if it still exists or if it exists under a different name. But yeah, give us the synopsis there.
Yeah, so Toronto One was back in 2003. There was a company called the Craig Network out west, and they had a channel called the A Channel and another channel I can't remember off the top of my head. And they came to Ontario, and they launched a new television station, and they called it Toronto One. I think Toronto One was definitely a station that was ahead of its time in what it was trying to do. It was, trying to be a station that was really diverse and featuring, a lot of different people from a lot of different cultures. Um, it was telling news stories in a lot more entertaining way. It was sort of the first place where I sort of remember, um, place that would add music to news stories, and would add sound effects to stories, and really definitely was trying to take the way that people consume news and make it a lot less newsy and more sort of, again, back to the sort of conversational, and more ways that people could sort of understand it a lot better. So yeah, it was on, I believe, on channel 15, if you had like cable back then. And yeah, it lasted for a couple years. Then Sun Media bought it and turned it into this, I guess a version of Sun TV. And then I'm not sure what happened after that, but I know that it no longer exists.
So what was being a senior producer like? Like, how did that differ from being a producer
Mhm.
in your previous roles?
So at the time, when it first launched, my job was sort of to oversee all the entertainment content on the news show called Toronto Tonight. So really, was just a producer at the time. Then they decided to launch an entertainment show called the A List. So my job as a senior producer was to sort of oversee this sort of content on that show. We had a writer who worked with me, and she was also a producer, and she produced some of the segments. And then I had four talent who worked on the show. So I worked with another with the executive producer trying to figure out the lineup of the show. I would then sort of do the lineup of the show. We would talk about these news stories off the top. We would slot this interview into this. After the first commercial break, we would do this interview in the third. Or we do the segment about movies coming to TIFF in this area. So it was really about trying to figure out the sort of flow of the show, then working with the writer, making sure that she knew how the show was flowing, and that she was definitely following this sort of path of the lineup, and then working with the talent to make sure they understood sort of what was happening. And then I would also be the person who decides which talent went out to interview which stars, and decide on which interviews we want to do and which ones we wouldn't do.
Have you ever watched the show, The Morning Show on Apple TV Plus?
Hmm.
Hopefully you don't have that level of drama that they experience because
No.
that show gives me anxiety. But
Yeah.
like Billy Crudup's character, were you usually behind the camera when they were rolling, or were you in the control room? Were you leading those meetings, those pre-production meetings as well? How
Depends.
does what you do compare to what we're being shown on that program?
Again, it would depend on the show I was working on. When I was at the A List on Toronto One, um, a lot of it was just I was just behind the scenes. I wasn't in the control room when that was going to air. There would be another producer and a director doing that, and we shot it in a different way. So the morning show is a live show. It was shot from whenever they start to when they're done, and they roll back tape or do live interviews. This show was packaged on a daily basis, so we would shoot the reporter stuff at a different time, and then put that together with the tape pieces that were already done and sort of edit it through a control room. When I did live shows at Entertainment Tonight Canada, then I would definitely be in the control room with the director, talking to the talent through their IFB, and making sure the show went from top to bottom the way it should.
Okay, perfect segue into ET Canada. So it
Hmm.
seems like the A List was trying to do what ET Canada was going to do before they were around. Was
Yes.
that kind of the pathway? Like when they were starting ET Canada, did the people working on that show look to the A List and go, "Look, we've got to get those people over here. They've already got the experience we need."
Funny enough, the executive producer at Toronto One who was on A List left Toronto One to go to Global TV to launch Entertainment Tonight Canada, Sav Shalev. I worked with him also at the Lofters, where he was the executive producer there as well. So he was the EP who started Entertainment Tonight Canada. He brought over myself, Ross Weston, who was one of the hosts on the A List, who became one of the reporters on Entertainment Tonight Canada. He brought over our director, another producer, our technical director, and probably a couple other people. So it was a bit of a, um, at the time, definitely the people who were at Toronto One weren't happy with what was happening. But at the same time, I think the people at Toronto One saw the writing on the walls that the station wasn't going to be around for much longer. And I think a lot of us saw that too. So we definitely took this new opportunity, and being a brand like Entertainment Tonight, that's a worldwide brand. Um, I think we all felt like this was the right sort of step for us to sort of move into that world. And yeah, it was definitely a, there were definitely aspects of what we did at the A List that continued on to ET, but a lot of it was definitely new because this is as again I said, this is Entertainment Tonight is the number one brand when it comes to entertainment news, so they knew what they were doing, and we learned a lot from our fellow producers in the States on how to do an entertainment show and how to do it properly.
How was that different then from the A-list? Because you guys were covering the exact same topics. You could almost say it's like Coke versus Pepsi. I mean, that might not be an accurate comparison, but you're both in the same business trying to do the same thing and competing for eyeballs. Because assuming you're on at the same time, everyone watching the A-list is unlikely to watch ET Canada and vice versa.
I would say more it was be a comparison between Coke and Tab, with
Okay.
A-list Tab and Entertainment Tonight Canada being Coke. Budget was obviously a huge thing. Global being a major network that was seen everywhere in Canada. Well, Toronto One was a local station. Definitely had an impact. Having a brand like Entertainment Tonight behind you gets you into a lot of rooms that you don't get into if you're not in Entertainment Tonight. So there was that, and also just like the sort of quality that ET in the States does. I would say A-list we were a fighting bunch, and I think it sometimes showed on broadcast because we didn't have the same access that an Entertainment Tonight gets. So a lot of times it was us sort of making up stories, not making up stories as in fake news, but trying to figure out what is if you can't talk to the star at the time, how do you talk about the star? So it would be we would be talking about J Lo, being with the first round of J Lo and Ben Affleck together. You'd be talking about it using clips from Geely, or using B-roll them out at the red carpet. Well, if you're at Entertainment Tonight, you would get interviews with J-Lo and Ben. It'd be a lot easier to tell a story.
You were promoted to executive producer.
Hmm.
That seems to be like the top level title
It is.
any producer like that can be bestowed upon a producer. I've always wondered, is it more about the business side when you become an executive producer? Like you still have one hand on the creative aspect of it, but now you might be fidgeting with budgets and looking at the numbers a little bit more than, say, for example, if you're just, I don't know what the opposite of an executive producer is, just a regular producer or a studio producer. But was that the case when you became executive producer?
Yeah. So before EPO was the supervising producer at ET Canada, and so that role, led a team of producers. They would all report into me, and the lineup and the content sort of was my sort of final this was my decision to make. But obviously the EP at the time could say yay or nay to things. But yeah, when you move into EP, your concern is a lot more than just the daily show. You're looking at everything from the brand, right? And you would deal with talent, the people who are on camera. You would, the producers would, you would have a management team that you would work with, who would all have people underneath them who, they would have to, they would deal with their own issues, and they bring to you. So you would have a manager who was in charge of editors or camera people or the control room, and they would come, they would meet with you and say, our director thinks this, and like, what, can we get new cameras? And then you have to look at the budget and work with a production manager who's in charge of the budget, and try to figure out if you are going to spend this year on new cameras, or you're going to spend the money this year on redoing the studio, what then are you not going to spend money on, and sort of try to figure that out. And as time went by, budgets got tighter and tighter and tighter, and you have to figure out how to do more with less. But yeah, the executive producer, again, it depends on the show and the industry and the part of the industry you're working in, but they can be anywhere from being very hands-on with the still being very hands-on with what goes the air, or they can be very hands-off and really focus a lot on the business. When you look at an executive producer, especially in film, a lot of that is really doing with the money and the finance, and have very little to do with the creative. I find executive producers in television, especially on a daily show like Entertainment Tonight Canada, they still have a lot to say about what goes to air, and especially like if it's sort of outside of the daily show. So if you're doing a special, or if you're doing series on something, they would have a lot more to say in that sort of realm.
Who is the biggest star you've ever met or covered?
Probably Tom Cruise.
You were there in the background while they were doing an interview with him. And it's funny, Tom Cruise has done so many movies, but the only thing I can think of is Mission Impossible. It seems like he's got a new it seems like since like 96 he's had a new Mission Impossible movie every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, he has, and then bring back Top Gun last year.
That's true. Top Gun as well, yeah.
So yeah, Tom did come into our studio once. We've done many interviews with him where we've gone to him, but he did come to Toronto, came up to the Global TV studios where ET Canada is filmed, and came in with a bit of an entourage. It was just after he had his child Suri when he was with Katie, and yeah, he came in. But the thing about Tom that I think is different from a lot of other stars is that he knows how to be a star in a room. He went up to, the to the floor director, to the audio person, to anyone who was sort of around him, and sort of said hi, and was very nice to everybody and made sure that people felt important, which I think is a rare thing these days. Sometimes that is missed when you get to the level of Tom Cruise. But yeah, he treated everyone quite well when he was in their presence.
I think I remember that moment because I was working at the CBC at the time in the media sales and marketing department, and he was coming in to do George Stroumboulopoulos' show, and literally the whole building shut down for that.
Yeah.
Not like with security, but anyone who wanted to try to get into, or anyone who wanted to would try to get into the studio just to watch that. And they usually had a couple of tickets kicking around, just
Right.
like you said, to fill seats if you wanted to stand at the back. But this was a big one. Like everyone was trying to get in to see Tom Cruise, and it was, I think, 2006, 2007.
Yeah.
Pretty sure it had to do with a Mission Impossible movie, but
Maybe for George, but we were doing it for I can't remember what it was called, but it had to do with World War II and Germany.
oh God, yeah, that was Valkyrie.
Yes, that's it.
Valkyrie, yes, I
Yeah.
remember that one. I had a friend at a previous job of mine who would go on and on about Tom Cruise being the last leading man in Hollywood, and that whole term or that construct was dying off. And to be honest with you, I kind of laughed when he'd said it, like that's not true. But seeing what Top Gun Maverick did for movie theaters coming out of the pandemic, and how he fought tooth and nail to keep it from going to Paramount Plus,
Yeah.
and just the amount of money it made, and it wasn't a comic book movie or a Star Wars movie or a Harry Potter movie, I kind of have to agree. And
Yeah, I
even
think so
even
too.
seeing like the trailer for the new Mission Impossible, I don't know about you, but it reminds me of action films in the 90s and in the 80s where it's like, if we're going to blow up a truck, you're going to buy a truck and we're going to blow it up. And we'll have three more and we'll do three more takes. It's not like, well, here's the green screen, we'll put the mountains in the background, and then the computers will blow up a truck that's not there. Like he does a
Yeah,
lot of in-camera stuff. That's what I'm
he
trying
does.
to
He
get
does a
at.
lot of his own stunts, hanging off planes, and he hurt himself once
Oh God, I know
filming
which
Mission
stunt you're
Impossible.
referring to. Yeah,
Yeah.
that plane. Oh God.
So, Tom is, I think, definitely, if not the last one of the, definitely one of the biggest stars. He's still one of the few people who can draw. He's had some movies that haven't done well, but he's still one of the few people who can draw a huge audience just on his name alone.
Jody, this has been a wonderful chat. Are you ready for rapid fire questions?
I think so. I think so. Nothing too
The
crazy.
Nothing crazy. The
Yeah.
production you are most proud of.
Definitely we did a New Year's Eve special for 5 years in Niagara Falls when I was at ET Canada. It's called ET Canada's New Year's Eve at Niagara Falls. The last one that we ever did, I think, would be the one I'm most proud of. It had Keith Urban was headlining it. Nick Jonas was performing when he went solo. We had Shawn Mendes on before he was sort of Shawn Mendes. Him and Nick did a duet together, which was pretty amazing. Lights was there as well, and we had Celine Dion come sort of from Vegas. She did a performance from Vegas that we taped and showed live on the show. There was about 60,000 people in the audience in Niagara Falls at the midnight, at the stroke of midnight. We had over 4 million Canadians watching from home, and a team of hundreds putting that show together. It was just amazing experience, and one that I look back on most fondly.
Your favorite movie?
I would say Notting Hill, because I am a big rom-com fan and a Hugh Grant fan, and I think just the chemistry between him and Julia Roberts in that movie. I can watch that movie so many times and still like it.
If Hollywood were to make a movie based on your life story,
Hmm.
who would you want to play you?
I would say Jake Gyllenhaal, only because, and I don't look anything like Jake Gyllenhaal, but when I was first introduced to my wife, it was through a colleague in Global Montreal, and she worked in Montreal as well. Someone said they knew who I was, and it was just in Toronto, and they had hung out with me at an event, and they said I looked just like Jake Gyllenhaal, and it's sort of become an inside joke between me and my wife, that I do not look like Jake Gyllenhaal, so I think that would make the most sense for him to play me.
So my follow-up question, if Hollywood were to make that movie based on your life story, what would you call it?
I would say A Boy Named Jody, because I don't know how many times I've got emails back saying hello, ladies, or
Oh, jeez.
people will meet me for the first time and they're shocked that I'm a guy. So yeah, I'll go with a boy named Jody.
Your favorite book?
I would say right now the favorite book I've read in a while is called Tomorrow, Tomorrow, Tomorrow. It's about these friends who make a video game. Um, and it goes through sort of the challenges of a male female relationship on a basis when you become colleagues with each other and work together, and sort of like what it's like when you see, from a male perspective, what it's like when you see your female friends start dating somebody and how that affects your working relationship, and just the whole concept of making video games and how they went about it. I just was so intrigued by it. I think it's a really good read.
Your favorite song?
It would be Jolene by Dolly Parton.
The best advice you have ever received?
Best advice I ever received is when you're thinking about where you want to go in your career, think about where you want to be in 10 years and then look at someone who's maybe in that position and look at what steps they took to get there. I think a lot of people, especially, I tell this advice back to, when I have interns come into my office and want to ask me like, how did I get to where I was, or things like that, is that I'm like, where do you want to be in 10 years? They give me an answer. And I'm like, now think about how you get to that. And because a lot of people will just be like, oh, I want to be that position tomorrow. And you're not going to be that position tomorrow. There are the odd times where, there will be the stories you'll hear about someone becoming something very quickly, but 99% of the time, you won't be that person the next day. You have to work on it and you have to think about how you're going to get to that path. It's almost like you're crossing a river. Make sure you see where that next stone is. You go for the next stone. You don't go for, the end of the shoreline.
My signature closing question: if you weren't in media, what would you be doing and why?
I think I'd be a writer. Did a lot of, even when I was at York, did a lot of short story writing. When I was a kid, I, was into writing a lot, and I I wrote my first children's book that came out in November, and now I'm working on my second. So I think I would possibly be a fictional writer.
And Jodie, where can they get the book?
They can get it at jodiedavis.ca.
And you're freelancing right now, so if anyone is looking for someone with your talents, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, they can either connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm there, or they can, I think that's probably the best way. Just find me on LinkedIn. If someone's looking for someone, whether it's an executive producer role, a showrunner, or someone to help them, come in as a consultant and look at what they're doing and try to make some suggestions on how to do things smarter and have a better return on investment, I'm your man.
So they can just slide into your LinkedIn DMs?
Just slide in, yeah.
All right. Jodie, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Victor.
That's it for today's show. For more episodes, you can go to mediapeople.ca, your favorite podcast platform, or youtube.com/@mediapeoplepodcast. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram @VicGenova.